Most Balatro runs don't actually die on the boss. They die in a shop. A completely normal shop somewhere in the middle of the run, where the game finally offers the one joker that would fix everything. The scaling the deck was missing. The pivot that would stabilize the strategy. The piece that suddenly turns a fragile run into a winning one. And then something strange happens. The player can buy it. Not because the game is unfair, not because the price is impossible, but because earlier in the run the player spent something they didn't realize was far more valuable than chips or multiplayer. And once it is gone, the run quietly loses the ability to survive. In Balatro, that resource isn't power, it is optionality. And most players lose it long before they realize the run is already collapsing. Most players think gold in Balatro is simply money. You spend it on jokers, you open packs, you reroll the shop until something useful appears. If you have enough gold, eventually the deck becomes powerful enough to handle the later antes. But that way of thinking about gold misses something fundamental about how the system actually works. Gold is not valuable because it turns into power. Gold is valuable because it preserves flexibility. It allows the run to remain adaptable long enough to respond to whatever the game gives you next. And once that flexibility appears, the run usually doesn't die immediately. Instead, it continues for a while, looking stable on the surface, until the moment arrives where adaptation becomes necessary. And suddenly, the run cannot adapt anymore. To understand why this happens, we need to look at a run where the economy quietly disappears. At the beginning, everything looks normal. The first shop appears, a joker shows up, and the player buys it. It is not an incredible joker, but it seems good enough to help with early blinds. Then another shop appears. The player rerolls once or twice, hoping to find something slightly better. Nothing unusual happens. The deck still works, the blinds are manageable, and the run feels stable. But something subtle is already happening in the background. Every small purchase and every reroll is draining the economy. The gold counter slowly drops, and the run begins losing the ability to respond to future opportunities. The moment where this becomes visible usually happens a few shops later. A joker appears that would genuinely improve the run. Maybe it offers scaling. Maybe it fixes a weakness in the deck. Maybe it opens an entirely new strategy. But the player doesn't have enough gold. They cannot buy the joker. They cannot reroll the shop. And at that moment, the run loses something much more important than damage. It loses options. The danger here is not the single joker that appeared in the shop. Runs in Balatro are rarely decided by one specific card. What actually determines the future of a run is how many chances the player has to search for solutions. If the player has gold, a bad shop is not a problem. It simply means re-rolling again until something useful appears. But if the player has no gold, the shop becomes static. Whatever appears in that moment is the only opportunity the run gets. And that means the entire future of the run suddenly depends on the randomness of a single shop. That is what it means to lose optionality. But to really understand why this is so dangerous, we need to talk about how Balatro actually generates power. Most runs don't become strong because of one perfect joker. They become strong because multiple small pieces eventually combine into something larger. A scaling joker appears. Then another card multiplies that scaling. Then a retrigger effect appears that amplifies the entire interaction. Power in Balatro emerges gradually as systems begin interacting with each other. And that means something very important. A run rarely knows what it needs in advance. Instead, the run discovers its strategy slowly through the shops. Each shop is a new opportunity to adjust the direction of the deck. Sometimes the game suggests a scaling path. Sometimes it offers a synergy that the player didn't expect. Sometimes it presents a pivot that changes the entire structure of the run. But for those opportunities to matter, the player must be able to respond to them. And that ability depends entirely on the economy. Now compare that situation to a different kind of run. In this run, the early shop still presents tempting purchases, but the player is slightly more cautious. Same jokers are skipped. Some rerolls never happen, and the gold slowly begins to accumulate. At first, this doesn't look impressive. The deck is not dramatically stronger, and the damage numbers are not exploding yet. But the economy is quietly building something extremely powerful. Freedom. When the shop appears now, the player is no longer forced to accept whatever happens to be there. They can reroll, they can open packs, they can search, they can pivot the run in a completely different direction if necessary. The shop stops being a gamble and becomes a search process. This is where the real role of gold becomes clear. When the economy is healthy, the bad shops stop being dangerous. They simply become another opportunity to search for something better. If the deck needs multiplier, the player can keep re-rolling until it appears. If the run needs scaling, the player can search for that joker that provides it. If the strategy needs to change entirely, the player has enough resources to make that pivot possible. Gold does not guarantee that the run becomes powerful, but it guarantees that the run remains adaptable. And adaptability is one of the most important survival traits in Balatro. This is why it's more accurate to think about gold not as money, but as optionality. Optionality means that the future of the run is still open. The deck is not locked into a single fragile strategy. When the economy is strong, every shop presents multiple paths forward. But when the economy collapses, those paths disappear. The run becomes trapped inside whatever strategy it happens to build earlier. And if that strategy turns out to be insufficient for the later antes, there is no way to fix it. When we place these two runs side by side, the difference becomes obvious. In one run, the player reaches a shop and simply cannot interact with it. The correct solution appears, but the run has no resources left to take it. In the other run, the shop is only the beginning of a search. The player has enough gold to keep looking until the right piece appears. The interesting part is that both runs might look almost identical in the early game. The difference only becomes visible later, when one run still has options and the other does not. Most players do not lose optionality in one dramatic mistake. Instead, it disappears through a series of small decisions. An early joker that felt safe, a reroll that seemed harmless, a pack that looked interesting but wasn't truly necessary. And eventually, these decisions do not look dangerous, but together they drain the economy. And once that flexibility is gone, the run becomes fragile in a way that is very difficult to recover from. What makes this especially deceptive is that the run rarely collapses when the economy disappears. The deck continues working for a while. The blinds remain beatable and everything appears stable. But the flexibility is gone. So when the game finally presents a challenge that requires adaptation, the run simply cannot respond. And that is when the collapse finally becomes visible. Balatro is often described as a game about scaling. Players talk about chips, multiplier, and powerful joker combination. But underneath all of these mechanics, there is another system quietly determining whether the run survives or not: the economic system. Players who understand this system treat gold very differently. They do not see it as a resource that must immediately be converted into power. They see it as something much more valuable, a reserve of possibilities. Because gold does not win runs by itself, but it allows the run to keep searching long enough to find that thing that will. If you enjoyed this kind of analysis, this channel is not really about individual runs. It's about hidden systems that decide those runs long before the final screen appears. Because once you start seeing this system, you begin to notice something interesting. Most runs were already decided much earlier than you thought. And this was just one of those moments. This was the first mistake. See you before the next one.